The next process that we're going to talk through is how a carbohydrate is broken down. So this is the process. We'll talk through each of them. So the storage form of carbohydrate is going to be glycogen. So if we are breaking down a stored form of carbohydrate, we'll convert glycogen into glucose. Okay, glucose is essentially what all of our carbohydrates are eventually going to be broken down to form. So we're really going to focus on this step forward, but know that any stored form of carbohydrates is stored as glycogen, and glycogen will be broken down to glucose. So let's just say we have glucose in the blood and that's being pulled into the cell. So the first process that happens is going to be called glycolysis. Okay, so glycolysis is the process of converting a glucose molecule into a pyruvate molecule. So there's a bunch of sub-steps here. There's a tons of enzymes. There's a rate-limiting enzyme, etc. But what we want to focus on for this class is know that during glycolysis, glucose is broken down into pyruvate, and in the process we create 2 ATP. So that's going to be our net ATP. So again, glucose is going to be broken down into pyruvate in a process called glycolysis. Okay, glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. Okay, so we're outside in the space of the cell. So this is going to be an anaerobic process. So again, glucose is converted into pyruvate. There's a ton of sub-steps and a ton of extra details that we're not going to cover. Just know in that process, we're going to create 2 ATP, and this process is called glycolysis. So glycogen, lysis is to cut or to split. So we're breaking down that glycogen or that glucose, depending on what substrate we're using. And this happens in the cytoplasm. So this is going to be anaerobic. Okay, so the next thing that happens is depending if oxygen is present or not. So what happens, what determines the fate of pyruvate is the presence of oxygen. So let's say oxygen is not present. So we're going to be anaerobic, O2 is not present. Okay, what happens is this pyruvate is going to be converted into lactate. Okay, obviously both of them will be converted into lactate molecules. Okay, we'll talk about lactate in a little bit more detail. So this would be considered anaerobic glycolysis because it's without oxygen. Oxygen is not present, our pyruvate will be converted into lactate. Okay, so again, anaerobic here. Okay. Now, if oxygen is present, we get to go into the mitochondria. So what I want you to think about in terms of oxygen is think of it as your ticket into the Super Bowl. You don't have a ticket, you're not going to the Super Bowl. So this is good. The mitochondria is our Super Bowl stadium, okay? If we don't have oxygen, we're not going in the mitochondria. You don't have a ticket, you're not going in the Super Bowl. So this is our Super Bowl arena, okay? No ticket, can't go in. No oxygen, can't go in. So let's say oxygen is present. We are not going to be forming lactate. So we're just going to take it this direction, okay? So let's pretend like we're following this one. So oxygen is present. Let me switch my marker color real quick. So we have O2. We've got our ticket to the Super Bowl, okay? So oxygen is present. What's going to happen to pyruvate now is we are going to enter into the mitochondria, okay? So we've got our ticket of oxygen. We get to go into the mitochondria, okay? So this is going to be considered aerobic metabolism for our carbs. Okay, so aerobic pyruvate will be converted into this molecule called acetyl-CoA. Okay, so oxygen's present. We are going to go into the mitochondria and convert our pyruvate into acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA will create 2 molecules of that, right? Because we've got 2 pyruvates going in there. If oxygen is not present, we're going to be anaerobic and we'll be creating lactate as a result. Okay, so in the process of converting pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, we're going to create a net of 5 ATP. So in that process itself, again, there's a lot of sub-steps. It's called the PDC, but we're not going to worry about that detail. So pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, If oxygen is present, if oxygen is present, we're going into the mitochondria, okay? We're gonna go to the Krebs cycle, and in that process of converting pyruvate to acetylcholine, we're gonna create 5-ATP. So the next thing that happens in the mitochondria is referred to as the Krebs cycle, also known as the citric acid cycle. So either of those terms can be used interchangeably. And essentially acetylcholine is going to go through, acetylcholine is going to go through this big process of changes. So in this process of changes and conversions, we are going to create a total of 20 ATP in the Krebs cycle. So technically, we don't create ATP directly. We have to take the products that are created here, and it goes to the electron transport chain, which we're going to talk about in just a second. So during the Krebs cycle, we create an ATP. Technically, it's a GTP, but it's converted into an ATP. So we've got an ATP, and then we're going to create a lot of these molecules called NADH and FADH. So they're essentially like little cars that transport hydrogen. You can think of them that way. And the hydrogen is what we're going to use to create ATP in the electron transport chain, which is going to be the next process off this. So we don't necessarily create ATP directly in the Krebs cycle. We create a couple molecules. But in the long run, really, we're forming a ton of hydrogens that need to go to the electron transport chain in order to create ATP. So we'll say 20 ATP are created in the Krebs cycle, but note that it doesn't directly generate it. There's an extra step in order to convert these into ATP. So again, let's do a quick overview. So if we've got stored carbs, glycogen, we're going to be converted into glucose. Or if we're just pulling glucose directly from the bloodstream, then we'll start here. Okay. Glucose will be converted into pyruvate through a process called glycolysis. In that process, we form 2 ATPs. Okay. This is going to occur in the cytoplasm, and it's anaerobic. If oxygen is not present, you don't have a ticket to go into the mitochondria, pyruvate will be converted into lactate. Okay. That's going to be anaerobic metabolism. So carbohydrates are one of the few fuel sources that can be used anaerobically or without oxygen. So no oxygen, pyruvate to lactate, will be anaerobic in nature. If oxygen is present, we get to go into our mitochondria superpole stadium. Pyruvate will be converted into acetylcholine. Sorry, I always want to say acetylcholine. In that process, we're going to create 5-ATP. Okay. Then what's going to happen is that acetylcholine is going to go through a ton of different transformations and processes in the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, which will produce a total of 20 ATP.